AFS founder and artistic director, Richard Linklater.
Thanks, Lars. And before I forget, when this film's over, we're gonna immediately, I had this idea to show a little clip of Albert Brooks from the 70s. Brooks was one of the all-time great comedians, I grew up watching him just on TV. I didn't know who he was, but these it's stand-up technically, but what he did was kind of etched in my mind. And years later on YouTube, I said, this thing I'd remembered forever, oh, that was Albert Brooks, that was Albert Brooks. I didn't really know, I was a kid. And the first season of Saturday Night Live, he did these films that, for me, not old enough quite to get, it always meant, oh, and now a film by Albert Brooks. It was like, oh, okay, time to go get something to eat. They were I didn't get them, they were sort of deadpan, but, as soon as I became a little cinema literate, I loved his first two movies, Real Life and Modern Romance, both just genius. And so I was really looking forward to this film back in summer of '85, Lost in America. And I gotta say, it's so nice seeing it here with a big audience, because and I've seen this film over the years, I haven't seen it in a while, but this is really the first audience I've ever watched this film with. And it wasn't for lack of trying. The first day, I went opening day, some theater, I think it was in North Austin. And I remember I always sat kind of right in the front, in the middle. And I realized the film's about to start, Lost in America, Albert Brooks' new film, I'm sure there's gonna be. And I look around and there's, it's opening day, man. There's like one guy in the back of the theater, and I said, uh-oh. But he must have thought I was crazy. Who's this guy up front just howling, laughing by himself? But that was me. It was like, ooh, another world of comedy had opened up. I think it was, if you were like an underground punk like myself and my friends at this time, this was the most scathing portrayal. It's hilarious, but it is and this is probably what kept it from being a big hit. And I don't mean to say the film was a huge bomb. I think it did okay. All Albert Brooks' films, people love him. He's a comic. But he was never huge box office. Even Woody Allen will have a big hit every now and then. Albert Brooks, I don't think he ever really broke through quite commercially. And I think I've had 30 whatever years to think about it. And I think it's because his realistic depictions. Oh, and by the way, I would never tell him that story personally, that I went to his film and there was two people came up to me once a long time ago. They, hey, we saw your movie. We really loved it. Oh, thanks. We were like the only people in the theater. I'm like, that's not a compliment to a filmmaker. I don't care what time of day it was. So Albert Brooks, I've seen other films where there are a lot of people in the theater. I don't know why what was I talking about? Oh yeah, his realistic portrayal. This movie, most comedy, and this goes in the books as a satire, but it doesn't have these trappings that so many, I'd say more overt comedies do. That's not stylized, it's not, even his comic style he doesn't let you, I don't know. When I think of Albert Brooks, I think of his comedy. He's on a high wire. And this is what's so brave and unique about him. He's up on a high wire, and he's created no net underneath him, as a comic. Think of if you think it's a small category of writers, director, and performers. That's a pretty small group. Going back to silent cinema, you got Keaton, Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, you got Jerry Lewis. There's people over the years. Not a whole lot, but there's usually a lot of visual humor, physical comedy. Woody Allen's case, he's such a great joke writer. There's constant jokes and punchlines. Albert Brooks has none of that. He has this kind of realistic depiction of what he's really trying to, show you. And in this movie, it's this kind of, it's a very vapid America. It's very just this nightmare of consumerism, materialism. His character, this couple, David and Linda Howard, I believe, they're just this depiction of yuppie hell that they don't even know they're in. It's like nothing is enough. At the very beginning of the movie, they're about to get a new, bigger house. He's obsessed with his new car he's about to get, and he plays these out just so brilliantly. And of course, he's about to get this huge promotion at this lame advertising agency he works at, and they're just in this hamster wheel of consumerism, and it's such a kind of, I would say, dark view of, and for that generation, and that's what I was saying as a more of a underground person in my 20s, you can only feel for these people who were came through the 60s, and this is very much, it mirrors Easy Rider. I hope everybody's seen Easy Rider, because this is his Easy Rider. And I always thought it's kind of funny that, Easy Rider, they actually do get across the country, at least to New Orleans, somewhere. In this movie, they start in Southern California, have that great trip to Vegas, and then they make it about as far as Arizona. So that's America they're lost in. But what he's really saying, the America they're lost in, is this materialistic view, this failed hippie notion of freedom, and they're just wrapped in their times, and it's such a curdled, view of that. It's painful almost. It's so acute. It's so, I think of that line, the famous Henry David Thoreau line, "Most men live lives of quiet desperation." Well, Henry would be amazed 150 years after he wrote that in Walden to encounter David here, probably the most desperate guy you could imagine, but he's not really quiet. He's I think that's Brooks's genius, is kind of he's like, I think, the best comic of anger in some way. There's this sweet spot he gets to that you really don't see much. He starts at, I guess, all that kind of insecurity and entitlement, and then you get to see him be just completely in disbelief as he doesn't get what he thinks he deserves or wants so badly. And then instead of, like most of us, just hanging out at disappointment, he sails past that and goes right to this raging fury that builds to a crescendo of complete apoplexy. That's the greatest thing about Brooks that I appreciate, and I really can't think of too many others, especially at his level, who have the pure guts to do this. Because I think most comics, most actors, most everybody, who doesn't, they want to be liked, even if they're comedies. They're this nervous, neurotic person, but they still have friends. They still, they still want to be liked. Albert Brooks doesn't care what you think about him. He doesn't necessarily want to be liked. He doesn't give a shit. The humor is at his expense. This is kind of the sweet spot of him that's so different from others. And that's why it's unnerving. He can be off-putting, and he doesn't care. This whole thing, and it's not him, but it's the ultimate compliment to all of us. And I think it has kept those masses away in a certain point, because he's not throwing you a lifeline like that. He's trusting you to have an analytical approach to what he's talking about, and a cultural history, some thoughts about society, consumerism, people, so he's assuming you can view that critique on that level, which is, of course, eliminates a high percentage of the American film-going audience. But but this film has gained a cult status. It has. But it was just, trust me, in the day it was unnerving. The year after I watched this first, I remember, this is the last thing I'll say before we start the movie. I remember, I just thought of this. I was in Southern California. I have an uncle and my aunt lived there, and they're kind of that generation. And I showed them the movie. We rented a video. I said, this is the funniest movie ever. And they were, they laughed, throughout. And at the end, they both looked and they said, we've talked a lot about getting a Winnebago and hitting the road. And that's kind of our dream. I was like, oh shit. So I realized for that generation, if you're an old hippie, who kind of went through the 80s. It was tough on them. This was some dream that has turned into some kind of nightmare. So welcome to their nightmare. Let's enjoy the film. After, we'll show this little clip. I just want to share one of many, but one little clip of Albert Brooks and his stand-up comedic prime. And then Lars and I will talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. So can't wait to see this movie with the big audience. Thanks. More like this, he does one where he's like, America needs a new national anthem. Do you guys know this one? He's taking auditions for a new national anthem. I saw this as a kid. I never could get it out of my mind, and I saw it not so long ago. And oh, that was Albert Brooks. It's just, it's really interesting, his stand-up career, because it wasn't that, I mean, if you remember the Tonight Show when Johnny Carson was on, there was a scene of him, you just like the clip reel at the beginning of the show, and there's this scene where Johnny Carson's like falling out of his seat laughing. Everyone knows that was at an Albert Brooks routine. In the 60s, he was young, he was but everybody says he's like the funniest guy ever. But I think he's really more of a filmmaker. I think he segues into filmmaking. He grew up with Rob Reiner and Richard Dreyfuss. They went to the same high school, and they said he and Reiner just went to movies all day long. So I think they were both aspiring filmmakers. Rob was in TV and playing Meathead. Albert was doing these comic bits and acting a little bit, but I think he was a writer and a filmmaker. He's such a, watching this film again, I guess I didn't, you don't always appreciate it, but I just think he's such an excellent director. It's really well done. Like I said, it's very realistic, but the score, everything's very integrated. It's not a clunky movie. A lot of comedians or people, they're not really filmmakers, but they have a skill and they want to entertain, but they're maybe not a natural filmmaker. They're kind of clunky sometimes. He's not. I think it's very smooth, well done movie. It's just a little unnerving.
You see it from the beginning. It's funny because like Woody Allen, I was speaking of a really good filmmaker, but like you watch Take the Money and Run, and it's like really rough.
Yeah, that is rough. Early films, yeah. But Woody Allen, you see him consciously become a much better filmmaker. But he was always making people laugh, and that would always carry the day. Albert Brooks from the jump was always unnerving, and just that, if you look at all his films, that you kind of come out of them just like, oh God.
It's a tightrope act, sort of in a way, of like what he's doing with his comedy, and it's so precise, and it requires just this perfect timing.
I know, and yet the timing it's kind of how it works on you. He'll overstay his welcome, constantly. That unnerving scene with Gary Marshall in Vegas. How long does that scene just go on? It's like, oh, he's just digging himself a hole. And even in this comic bit we just saw, you see a comic dying, just digging himself a hole, just like he knows there's humor to be mined in that it's over, but let's keep going, it's relentless, man.
And like those bits were famous. He was famous for those bits just not working most of the time. Because he would go and do those bits in like Philadelphia or Cleveland or someplace, and like they wouldn't work. People would take pity on him. They would bring him food.
Well, because they don't get it, Like we all grew up with lame ventriloquism. They think, oh, he's not very good. It's like, no, you're missing the joke altogether. It's like, but it's like the people who went in at the same time. I'm reminded, I did a couple films with Castle Rock, and they're the guys they worked with him on Modern Romance, and they had done Spinal Tap, and this era. I remember, it's the same people who don't get that are the ones who came out of Spinal Tap, again, in the day, where they said, it was okay, but why didn't they get a better band to do it about? It's like, there's this literalism, and Spinal Tap didn't do well. There's this literalism that permeates, so much of the world that they just, it's a kind of and it's not sophisticated, it's a dummy, it's kind of broad humor by a lot of standards, but it's kind of sad that that's sophisticated. But
To reach a wide audience, so humor has to like work like on a pretty broad, like Jim Carrey or somebody who's a really subtle actor, he's really funny, he's really good, but it has to work on the broadest level to reach the broadest possible audience. Yeah. But then it can also work on this really subtle level. There's no broad level where this is working.
Yeah, he never gives you the broad. Like I think a current genius is Sacha Baron Cohen. You know, couldn't be more physical and crazy, but his critique and his intelligence permeate. You know, he's high-low constantly. You know, it's also unnerving. If you saw What Is America last year, holy crap. But yeah, so it's a fine line. But I just think Brooks is just one of the all-time greats, and he just hasn't made he hasn't made that many movies, you know. But
it's interesting too that when you watch these movies, it's like he's directing himself, he's directing everything else, and he's able to just jump into the scene and like be this character who's, you know, he's not getting probably a lot of feedback, he's not getting laughs.
Yeah, you know, you don't get anything. But I think it's a very written and process, and you know, you get great people.
Yeah.
Julie Haggerty, how great is
So
she?
good, so
You know,
good.
You can't for a second. I mean, between Airplane and this, you know, just I mean, she's had a career, done everything, but her timing and just everything about her in this is so perfect. You can't imagine anyone else, you know.
Everything's so heartfelt, and she's just a victim of this maniacal, you know, narcissist.
Yeah.
And we feel so bad for her.
Yeah. So anyway, well, we're just gabbing. If you guys have anything you want to add, or I don't know, you know.
Yeah, who's got a question or a contribution or anything
Albert
from our
Brooks
audience?
love, anything you want to throw out, feel free to.
Nothing? Wow.
Feel free to join us.
Right over here.
How does this fit into Albert Brooks's work? Does it tend to be like this? Is it not like this?
Well, they're all kind of like this, to some degree. And I mean that in the best way. Yeah, he's definitely, there's a consistency. I would go back to the beginning. Real life is, you know, there was a famous PBS thing called, in the 70s, he was sort of sending up. What was that called?
Was it American Family? It was the Loud Family, but it was...
The Loud Family, but was it called American Family?
I think it was called American Family, which is, I think it's called,
So he takes, like, he's doing a real film about a real family. Charles Grodin plays a veterinarian. It just, you know, it ends up, I haven't seen that in ages.
It's great.
But
I watched it recently.
I still remember so much. I mean, you know, it's one of those things. Isn't the house just burning down at the end?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that tells you he burns down the house of his real family. You know, and then in modern romance, it's this desperate portrait of a relationship. It's just kind of the worst. You know, the need and selfishness, and it's just really a painful movie. I mean, it's hilarious, kind of like this, but it's even more cringy, I think, than this. Do you agree, modern romance fans? It's a tough one. It's so off the chart hilarious, but it's like, oh, you know, like I don't want you until you leave me, and now I want you more. It's like, oh gosh.
The person I watched Modern Romance with was just like, can we take a break from this, like midway through the movie, because it was so cringy.
Yeah, and that one's very self-reflexive. He's an editor. There's just so many great lines. He's a film editor. So that one's, and real life's about making a movie. This is one of his few that he's not, often he's in and around the film industry. And so it's pretty close to home. But this one, yeah, he's not. But his brother, Albert Brooks, has a brother who was a bigwig at an advertising firm. So I think he was his alter ego, like there for the grace of God go I, always this example. So in several of his movies, he works in advertising. You know, I think Brooks rightly sees the era as like the worst thing you could, in the Bill Hicks tradition, if you're in advertising, kill yourself.
Right.
So he's kind of an exponent of that, I think.
And probably most people know this, but his other brother was Bob Einstein,
Yeah.
Super Dave Osborne, Marty
Super Dave.
Funkhauser. Just died pretty recently.
Yeah.
He was great too. He has some great bits.
And
in,
Gary
Albert
Marshall,
Brooks.
we lost him. Not that I mean, he's a sweet guy. If nothing else, that scene in the Vegas.
So good.
I like Wayne Newton. The schmucks who like Newton. I like Wayne.
So good. I see a hand right back here.
So when it comes to like how much, so I couldn't help but notice like during the scene with the kids with the bikes, the kids match their bikes. Like when it comes to color coordination. So I was wondering if Albert Brooks had kind of a thing throughout his movies where he just like was very visual and color coordinated and things like that, where he did more things like that around, like symbolism or something.
Yeah, I don't know if it's symbolism, but I just think he cares about the image. You know, I think he's paying attention to everything. That's what I mean. He's not like a lazy, like, hey, you just filmed the movie, I'm going to be in it. I think he's a really thorough. I don't know. He didn't write books about it like Jerry Lewis and stuff, but he's, I don't know. I just think he's I think when you're that funny and you're known as a comedian before and you'll always be a funny guy, maybe you don't maybe they don't give him quite the credit as a actual, all-around filmmaker.
There's all this sort of like tracking shots down the
Yeah.
hallways and things that are clearly there for a reason. And the movie starts with that Rex Reed interview on Larry King.
I had forgotten how long, again, overstaying your welcome right off the bat. Like,
Right.
what the hell? We gotta, it's like Rex Reed. What's that?
He kind of discredited everything else in the film industry whenever you watch a film by, he was irreverent.
Yeah, right off the bat. I
But
guess he got-
when you lead a film like that, it also almost makes you think, is this a sort of thesis statement of the film? What
I had
Rex Reed is
totally
talking about.
forgotten that was in my intro. I said I watched it alone in the theater and was howling laughing, but I wasn't laughing at that part. I was
Yeah.
still figuring out what the hell movie I was watching. But where's this going? Rex Reed and on Larry King. But so I don't know what would you say?
It's just like why do you think that's there? Like, is it some kind of weird
self-critique about
Maybe.
comedy with the I don't know. Did he? And then he's awake listening to it, turning. I don't know.
It's almost
That's a
like
weird-
everything like has its little piece and a little purpose, and it's so economical.
Yeah,
and then there's that,
I
which is like,
trust
why the
it's
hell
in
is that
there.
there?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to ask Albert
But
Brooks.
you see the house that's under, they're clearly moving, and you learn quite a bit.
I see a hand in the back.
It's kind of two questions with the short. It feels like any authority figure or like what was supposed to be an imposing character was very. They were like softballs. It was like they weren't very imposing. They weren't very stern. They weren't very scary. Even the guy that was supposed to beat him up, who was tall. The boss was kind of likable. The only guy that wasn't likable was the guy who was like trying to get him to go to New York. Did you?
What's his name that he meets at the very end? Is that
Brad.
Yeah. I love it so much that he just finds that parking place right on the street. I was wrong when I said he doesn't have that much visual humor. I mean, that is just classic film joke. You could find a parking place with any kind of car, but much. And there's Brad. That's a beautiful little bookend, I think, to the whole movie. But yeah, authority figures. Yeah, I don't know. Are there bosses? I think he's kind of making fun of everybody, but yeah, they're kind of likable. His main boss.
Yeah, you're
It's not
definitely like on
bad.
the boss.
cop's a good guy, kind of. The only guy is the guy who picks up his wife hitchhiking. He does give him a bloody nose, but.
You're kind of on the boss's. The guy's trying to fire him. You're just kind of like, well, what's this guy's gonna
some
do?
growth there, yeah.
Yeah.
And he hires him back. I guess he must have said yes. At a 31% pay cut. But
What benefits?
To what degree do you think that his outburst sounded like George Costanza?
many years before.
Yeah.
No, like there's connections between.
Well, put it like this: Brooks is very influential. I think he's one of these, like I said, comic that people learned. There's a modern school of comedy that grows out of his particular. None of them seem to have the guts to go as far as he does, but everybody worships him. Judd Apatow, everybody worships him, but you can't really replicate exactly.
There's a whole family tree in a way of
Yeah.
of kind of anti-comedy comedy that comes out of this, where you see Albert Brooks, Larry David, Judd Apatow, Gary Shandling. It's a whole sort of thread.
Steve
that
Martin
ran through.
too.
Steve Martin.
He's a contemporary.
Yeah.
I would say in the '70s. Those are the mind-blowing.
Mhm.
Richard Pryor in his own way, in a very different way, but the guys who were sort of deconstructing comedy and reinventing it to its core, I think, would be Steve Martin and Albert Brooks.
It started off in
others.
clubs and went to TV in a big way. It went to movies. So.
Yeah, caught a great wave there.
Yeah.
Where Steve Martin was selling out arenas. I just don't think Albert Brooks had that kind of stand-up ambition. As great as he was, I think he would just come up with these bits. And he lived in LA. They were putting him on all kinds of shows as a young guy. I think he was in his teens and early 20s. He was showing up on TV. Because Carl Reiner, because they all grew up together, said, I think as a 14-year-old, if you dig in, there's some stories of he would invite Albert Brooks to come hang out with his son and be at all their parties because he was so damn funny. He would just do these stand-up routines in their living room. So no one was surprised that he's on TV, but he would just come up with these bits. And I don't know. I don't think I don't think he wanted like a stand-up career the way Steve Martin took it to arenas and 70,000 people, showing up at a show. I mean, he burned out on that. I mean, I don't know if he burned out, but he quit that and did only movies at a certain point. So
Can you imagine what a role you are? Because I was a kid who tried to be funny all the time. Like, what a role you're on as a funny kid that like Carl Reiner's like, oh, you get this.
yeah, the king of comedy himself
This
is
kid,
like,
yeah.
hey, you're good. And you're like,
That'd be the best.
Yeah.
Right over here.
So seeing it on the big screen, I totally agree about how there's so much attention to like the visuals, and it's interesting to think about. I feel like recently, in the past couple of years, there maybe haven't been as many like really cinematic comedies like that coming out. Like I don't think movies like that get made. And I feel like a lot of that has kind of shifted to television, and I was wondering if you agree and kind of why you think that might be.
oh no, there's always a good comedy here and there. I don't know about like cinematic quality. It's hard to say. I mean, TV is the place, but I don't really judge them cinematically. What does anybody think? What's a great cinematically comedic TV show?
Patriot.
Gotta be out there.
There's been a whole revolution since Arrested
Yeah.
Development of like the,
Sure.
of the change in perspective that you have in a sitcom,
Mhm.
and you have very few kind of 3-camera sitcoms anymore.
Yeah. No one. Yeah,
It
that-
seems
that
like it's
kind of ran
holding-
its course.
Yeah.
Speechless maybe? Speechless maybe?
Speechless. I don't see any of these. I'm
Yeah.
out of it. I'm sure it's great.
Veep is good filmmaking.
You gotta
Right.
watch Patriot on Amazon Prime. It's fantastic filmmaking and fantastic comedy.
There we go.
Yeah,
Patriot.
it just,
What's it called?
Patriot.
it feels like when you go to the cinema, the intelligent comedy is a dying genre.
Any Crackle shows we're missing out on? I see a hand all the way in the back.
I love the movie, love that one approach, but I was wondering, if you were to say that you had a weakness as a filmmaker, what would you say it was?
He had a weakness?
Yeah.
Not for me to judge. I think he's himself, beautifully. So I think that's a triumph. Weakness? I don't know. I think if you're a studio head, you might critique before the reasons why he's not that. They would consider that a weakness, but I sure don't. I don't know. Does anybody have an opinion on?
You cut his Achilles tendon.
What's that?
Get him on the heel.
Yeah.
Wasn't getting his sticks correctly.
He thought his own weakness was that he was not an engaging enough leading man, and he tried to get Bill Murray for this. But this was the year of Ghostbusters, and Bill Murray's people told him, "Sure, Bill would love to do it. How's 1987 for you?"
Yeah.
It was 3 years after this, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's what he thought his Achilles heel was, that he didn't have enough sort of engaging properties as a performer, but it all works out, I think.
I mean, can you imagine anyone else trying to pull this off? I mean,
Bill Murray, maybe you could imagine that.
Yeah, but I don't know. Would he be? He couldn't hit that level of anxiety, desperation that Albert Brooks.
Yeah,
no
it's
one
really
can
true.
hit those notes.
It's really
like
true.
that. I really don't think so. It's a different movie.
Mhm.
Like comedy in general. You put a different person in there, it's a whole different movie. That's what a great comedic performance is. No one else could do it. Charles Grodin is great, especially with him, but his deadpan, his demeanor, he's wicked funny, but he couldn't play that.
You've got to see Real Life. Whoever just said Charles Grodin, if you haven't
Yeah.
seen it, like
Grodin's
Charles Grodin,
the
directed by
genius,
Albert Brooks. Oh my
he's
God.
fantastic.
And also watch all his Tonight Show appearances on YouTube if you haven't. This fellow right over here. So
I'm not sure if it's really a question or not, but like you're talking about weaknesses, and maybe it's what you were hitting at earlier about how he likes to take something funny and just push it way past.
Yeah.
Like over Mother's Day, 'cause on the Criterion Collection, they've got his movie Mother.
Mother.
Debbie Reynolds.
Debbie Reynolds.
And maybe it's also he has a fixation with furniture and moving, like in here at the beginning of the movie, he moves a chair around and an ottoman around the room for like 12 freaking minutes.
Yeah.
Right?
Twice as long as you would
Right, and like
think.
you're just picturing the studio
Always.
head with the calculator going, holy
Yeah.
shit, how long, but it's hysterical if you get the joke and how much
Yeah.
angst he's
But I could see just
roaming around the room with.
film industry, he must drive him crazy. I've never really heard stories about what it's like to work with him as a director. I don't know, I imagine he has Final Cut, keeps his budgets low. but I could see those note sessions after the test screening. It's like, that furniture moving ottoman, we could maybe lose a little bit of that. And he's like, no, don't you get it? That's what's funny. I'm sure they're like, we could cut out of the scene right there and no one would miss what comes out. You're like, oh yeah, they'd miss it. Whether they like it or not, they'd miss it. Like I could see those sessions.
That whole part,
I don't know.
That whole part is kind of off of the Jerry Lewis tradition, because Jerry Lewis, who had been the biggest box office draw in the world, would often do a thing where he'd fall down and slip on the floor for 8 minutes of screen time.
Just keep, yeah.
Yeah, and it's almost kind of a defying anybody to cut that.
But Jerry was so successful, I'm sure he could do whatever. He was blessed with a sensibility that's completely in sync with not only the American public, the system. He triumphed,
until he didn't
in the system. But he had a good run.
Yeah, but Albert Brooks had none of that. He had no cover.
Never.
He never made a movie that made anybody a swimming pool or anything.
Yeah, I don't think so. But I know the people who worked with him on these, they're certainly proud they did, but I don't know. At the time, it was probably a struggle.
Broadcast news, though.
Yeah, as an actor.
Yeah. He was basically the same character in
That's
a lot of ways, but he was in this ensemble.
It's a great use of him as an actor.
My mother, she loved him in that movie. She would never watch an Albert Brooks movie.
But him in that
He
movie.
was hilarious.
Yeah, I think his first really acting gig is Taxi Driver.
Yeah.
There he is, Sybil Shepherd's, fellow campaign worker, and apparently they let him. He improvised and came up with a lot of that. And, Scorsese let him, kind of create a character there. But yeah, he's wonderful in that.
Isn't that weird casting? In Taxi Driver, this Albert Brooks is there.
But he's great.
Yeah, he really is. But
He's
it's
so great.
It's visionary
We
casting.
don't pay for the buttons. I think there's a difference between we are the people and we are the people. Put it like this: we don't pay for the buttons.
The other super weird casting of him is in Drive a few years ago, which is such
Well, he's playing
out of nowhere.
He's scary and funny.
Well,
Yeah,
he's been
he really
doing
is.
that lately. You see him playing the bad, he's in Concussion. He's kind of, I think they're using him to be a scary presence because I guess he's a little older and he's probably intimidating to some people, and yeah, so he's graduated into being just dark, no humor, just
What an all-time Hall of Fame weird career trajectory.
bad guy.
I see a hand right over here.
They just kind of seem lost to me, like Arizona to New York and then Houston.
Yeah, right.
Well, they go through this. They go on I-10, takes you right through Houston, right? Have you done that trip?
They got lost. To me, it was before Atlanta, when really to be after Atlanta.
It is
South
the-
Carolina. That was the only one I saw.
But they took 10 to.
You go 40, right?
was
When you go 40?
Take a left
Pre-
stop sign.
You notice they have maps and stuff. They're lost. They don't have all
That's pretty damn lost,
they
though.
don't have computer tracking. But I heard they actually had to send that Winnebago second unit, of course. It actually had to go on a road trip because you had to film it going through these places. So,
We should do a double feature,
That's-
this and Winnebago Man.
I know.
Ooh, actually, the real double feature would be this and Easy Rider, of course.
yeah. I'm doing that tonight. Over the New Year, I watched Easy Rider again for the first time in a long time, certainly since Dennis Hopper passed away, and just had a great viewing of that movie I hadn't had in years. And I thought, oh, this,
Yeah.
got to see this now.
Yeah, dead on.
Just like,
Yeah, it references the movie so many times. Let's see. I see a hand right over here.
So, typically screenplay books rules say show, don't tell. This movie does a lot of comedic tell, don't show. How, as a director, if you were to read a script like that, how would you react to that?
well, I'm a big, tell, don't, like, let's talk more about it. It doesn't bother me. I don't know, as a director, it's a sensibility, but certainly professional note givers and studios and readers, and that's what really kills cinema, and particularly like a singular comedic voice, when a bunch of people, even though they're well-meaning and boy, everybody thinks they're really funny and smart, but when they kind of start judging it before, and then you talk to truly gifted comedic actors, and like, God, I signed up for this movie and I'm on the set, and they just think this is hilarious, but I know it's lame, but we have to do it. You know, they're not trusting their instincts. So it's a tough thing to pull off in a big system where a lot of people think they're really good at it. You know, so I'm a believer in like one comedic sensibility all the way, and just go, or just a few, you know, like whatever, but not, I don't know if they get made by, you know, committee so much.
The sort of screenwriting orthodoxy that we sort of refer to here, is there any like value in that? Because like John Ford would make great movies where he would show, don't tell, and they're perfect movies, you know, they're perfect John Ford movies.
Well, it depends on what story you're telling.
Yeah.
What are you trying to say, and how, you know, movie, no rules, it can be anything, you know, so.
Yeah, write that down, no rules, it can be anything.
It can be, you know, just make it work, but you gotta sucker them into financing you
Rule
somehow.
1, make a good movie. Rule 2, don't make a bad movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take that, Sid
Hard to
Field.
do. Yeah, don't make a bad movie.
Yeah. I saw a hand back here, yeah.
Yeah, I had two things. One, this is the one that was Kubrick's favorite, wasn't it?
Is that true?
Yeah, I heard Kubrick is a big Albert Brooks,
Oh, it's Modern Romance.
the one before Modern Romance.
He pulled up Albert Brooks, the movie The Family.
And the other thing was, when you were going on YouTube, did you see, I think it's the real life trailer?
Uh-huh, it's great.
The one that's in 3D, or not in 3D?
I contemplated showing adding
Oh,
that to
I haven't seen that
Oh,
in
It's
years.
it's in 3D, but like, and it has like the guy from House of Wax who's like
Oh, right.
the paddle
Doing
ball.
the
You used to do the gag where like, reach under your seat for the 3D glasses, and there's no 3D glasses. So
Right.
it's like ping pong at
Let's stop spoiling this trailer for everyone. Just go watch the trailer because it's genius, really. Clark, I see it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna stick up for John Ford. His first color movie, Drums Across the Mohawk or whatever it is,
Right.
Drums Along the Mohawk. They got behind. He couldn't film the battle scene, and so he had Henry Fonda sit against a stone wall, and he just fired questions at him. And that's the scene you see. Henry Fonda describes the battle that is already over, and there's no battle. He's just like, oh, and the horses were jumping over, and then someone got a horse on the spear. It was horrible. It's an amazing scene, but it's all tell, no show. There's no show at all. He doesn't even move. He just sits there. He just sits there and describes the battle.
But, you know, he's got Fonda, right?
Yeah.
It's a heavy Fonda
Joe
night.
Blow, not so interesting. Fonda?
It's funny, in all the world of everybody that I could have made a misstatement about John Ford in front of, like the one person on earth is this guy right here, who's an expert on John Ford. I see a hand right over here.
Yeah, just about the Rex Reed thing. Like, I grew up in New York, and he was like a very divisive figure.
Oh yeah.
The what thing?
And
Rex
this is the
Reed.
kind of movie-
Oh, yeah, Rex Reed, yeah. Very.
I mean, this is the kind of movie he would have hated, or he would have written a bad review about, because it's insulting to people. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like,
What kind of movie did Rex Reed like?
crowd meetings. Like, he wrote for New York Post, which is a brand.
Oh, yeah, we've all been Rex Reeded. You know. He clearly approved that, you know, he had to license that. But he's a showboat. He was the most famous film critic. Like in 1970, he's the only really. Pauline Kael, but Rex Reed is starring in movies. He's everywhere. He's on, you know. Yeah,
He's a complicated figure. Yeah.
Big public figure, big, funny, you know, just extroverted guy.
But not you wouldn't call him a serious critic. I mean, he was like a great reviewer, and he was a showboat. Yeah.
But you know, I don't mind. You know, I take that back a little bit. Rex Reed, he ripped me for like 10 movies, and then he suddenly loved a movie or two. I was like, oh, what happened to Rex? He's being all sweet in his old age or something.
Which one did he like?
I don't remember, but I remember I was at a critics thing, and Wes Anderson is so funny. He gets up and goes, oh, it was the LA film critics. The thing I love about the LA film critics is that you don't include Rex Reed. And then he read some of Rex Reed's reviews of his movies. They're precious, pretentious, I've hated them all. And Wes is just reading these scathing reviews of his own movies by Rex Reed. And I talked to Wes after. I said, Wes, give it about 4 more movies. He's going to turn around and he'll be. If he lives long enough, you're going to end up liking Rex.
More questions like that. That was a great. We got some great stuff here. I see a hand back here.
Hi, one thing, I mean, a couple movies that are amazing at telling and not showing is the Before trilogy, of course. And okay, my question is basically, so what extent do you think that this movie was kind of a period piece and captured like the zeitgeist of that age that really found Easy Rider, formative in their view of the world?
Yeah, like I said before the movie, I think that's the reference point for a whole generation of, the symbols of freedom. Even though that movie, look at the way they even say, Fonda says, hey, we blew it, and they end up both dead. But that is some kind of impulse, I guess, of that generation. And, I think it's an eternal American impulse, at least post-war. So, what is freedom, that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's a good reference point. And I don't know, everyone, you have to have some kind of relation with Easy Rider. I think it's that important of a film. Like, I've had different feelings. First I liked it, then I went through a period of not liking it, thinking it was really obvious and trying too hard and all that. But I had this great reconciliation with it, like I said, over the holiday. I saw it and I just fully accepted it and went, oh God, I just love these guys. I love it. I love all these, the tracking shot when they're at the, when he's talking to the cop. Yeah. Nicholson with the football helmet.
But the thing is, when you see these 80s movies, like it's you have to remember this is 15 years after Easy Rider, It's like, it's not that long.
It's not that long compared to then to now, 34 years.
Yeah.
Coming up this summer, so yeah, it's still really fresh, but just enough for them to go from early 20s idealists to 30s little sellouts. That was the 80s yuppie conundrum they all found themselves in. I think our generation, we were just like, we knew not to even begin there. Just their lesson we could kind of skip that altogether.
But it was a thing that a lot of movies sort of chewed on, was the sort of difference, like what had happened, like Return of the Secaucus 7, which comes up in the series.
Next week.
It was a thing that a lot of movies kind of chewed on, was like Vietnam generation and like sort of protest generation.
Where are we now in the 80s? They're all in their 30s. What these hippie idealists from the 60s, by the 80s, they're in their 30s, adult responsibility, kids, lives, careers. So Return of the Secaucus 7 next week is it's a really well written, thought out contemplation of that. It was before Big Chill. It's the Little Chill. Return of Secaucus 7. So
yeah, so we've got that coming up next Wednesday, but then before that we've got on Monday, Chan is Missing.
Yeah, next week is American Indie. So, this was kind of a small studio film, I guess, and but the 2 we're showing next week is really American Indie Week. Let's consider it that. Down and Dirty, like low budget first film. I'm interested to see these 2 films next week that I haven't seen either one in a long time. I mean, decades now.
Wow.
So I'm really curious to see, and I saw each of them, like I had this pattern. I see it a couple times in the day, 2 or 3, and just think I know it. And that's why it's so fun to see these again, like when you haven't seen a film in 30 years, but you feel like you know it really well. To see it again and just kind of, well, is that a good movie? Is that, whatever. And this series has been wonderful. There's so many of the films, it's like, God, that's better than I even remember. That's been the predominant feeling. But I'm a little cautious heading into next week with these 2. But it's a good example, whatever you feel, like there's what a super low budget film was in the 80s. You still shot on 16 millimeter. One of the Chan is Missing, I think they did for 20 grand, which was kind of the least you can do a movie for, kind of back then. And then Secaucus is basically that. It's like 60 grand, but I think they paid scale to their actors, and
Yeah.
you know, Sales was a professional screenwriter. But definitely those are like first films, kind of from your neighborhood in your backyard. What a filmmaker could do for that first film, you know, just make what you know, make what's right in front of you, make a movie about you and your friends, make something from your own backyard. So they're both, I think, certainly for my generation, they were both very inspirational examples of that. And I don't know if that even exists. John Pearson will be up here with me on Monday night. We'll talk a lot about that, you know, what the vibe was in the 80s, early 80s to mid 80s about, you know, just that, well, you know, what was going on in the cinematic landscape. I think that's largely lost now, you know. You don't see this weird indie film that made for a low budget. Like, they're all made for a low budget. There's 10,000 low budget indie features made every year now. Back then there was, you know, 70, maybe 100, maybe not, I don't know, very few. So just their presence meant something. And I'm not saying that's a critique of now. I just don't think there's any one film, or maybe I'm just out of it, that's like these films I've shown, you know, Stranger Than Paradise, some of the ones we've hit on in the series, and I think these two next week are good examples of those that made you want to pick up a camera and make a movie, you know, so I put them in that category, that's always a fun category.
I think what you get with that now is like a movie like Thunder Road, which came out last year. How many people saw Thunder Road? That's not a lot. Like, I mean, that's great, but like, that's not a lot.
Okay,
like,
because the films, they don't keep them in the theaters for 3 months, and they're not writing reviews of them they're not treating them like of cultural importance, you know, or as at least worthy of that kind of extra review, and deep think pieces. There's just so many, so it's a glut. So in a way, it's the best time to be a filmmaker. You can get these films made. It's just tough to, I think, have the cultural breakthrough, cultural impact that was possible back then, just because there's just so much. The market's so saturated. I mean, TV alone takes up so much of everyone's space, you know, so I don't know.
What's the goldener age? Like that age where it was really hard to make a movie, but if you made a movie, you had an audience, or now where it's kind of relatively easy to make a movie, but
really hard to get an audience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think the 80s, 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was by birth, you know, I was also lucky to make some weird little films that seemingly hung out in theaters.
Because if Slacker came out, you know, now.
Oh shit, you know, we wouldn't get in Sundance. We wouldn't get in the competition, or we wouldn't, you know, it would be a sidebar kind of thing, just a curiosity maybe.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Maybe, I think, you know. But yeah, it's hard to. But that doesn't mean you can't. You still have to aspire, because the thing is, people do see the movies, you know, they're available. You can watch it on, you know. So it's kind of a push pull, you know. It's you know, no big judgment, but I'll be curious what John Pearson has to say next week about a lot of this.
John Pearson
was there.
Exactly. Yeah, he had the greatest sort of seat in the house for like the sort of indie revolution of this period, and it'll be great to hear you guys talk. Well, I think we'll wrap it up for tonight. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you so much. Come next week, and it's just so fun tonight. Thanks so much, Rick. Viva Albert Brooks.